The agreement no one remembered signing. It shaped markets for decades, redirected capital across borders, and constrained governments long after creators were gone. Yet almost no one could point to the moment it was approved. No speeches, no celebration, just an agreement that slipped into place and never left. To understand why this forgotten agreement mattered, we must return to a Europe exhausted by negotiation. Treaties piled up, reforms stalled, leaders needed progress without reopening conflict. So they stopped calling decisions political and started calling them technical. Rules were embedded quietly, framed as procedures rather than commitments. And because they sounded temporary, no one asked how permanent they would become. The first reveal appears in the fine print of coordination frameworks between financial institutions. What looked like optional guidelines slowly hardened into standards. Compliance was encouraged and expected, then assumed. Markets adjusted behavior not because the rules were enforced, but because deviating became inconvenient. Over time, the agreement stopped feeling external. It felt like reality. The second beat followed as new participants entered the system. Banks, regulators, and governments operated under these standards without questioning their origin. They trained staff around them, built software to enforce them, designed policy within their limits. The agreement no longer needed signatures. It reproduced itself through habit. What made this powerful was its invisibility. There was no moment to oppose, no clause to repeal without unraveling everything attached to it. The agreement had escaped politics by embedding itself inside process. And long after its authors moved on, it continued to decide what was possible and what was not, all without anyone remembering when they said yes. As the reveal deepened, the agreement's reach became easier to trace, but harder to challenge. What began as coordination between institutions quietly expanded into constraint on governments themselves. Budget assumptions aligned with its logic. Risk models deferred to its parameters. Even political promises were filtered through what the agreement would allow. Choice narrowed without ever being debated. The conflict emerged when crises demanded deviation. Sudden shocks required speed, flexibility, and judgment. But the agreement was not designed for judgment. It was designed for consistency. Emergency measures had to be justified against standards no one remembered authorizing. Delays followed. Frustration grew. Leaders blamed markets. Markets blamed credibility. The agreement remained silent and unchanged. The buildup intensified as critics finally began asking the forbidden question: who decided this? Inquiries led to committees. Committees led to working groups. Working groups led back to documents that cited each other in endless loops. Authority dissolved into reference. Responsibility vanished into structure. There was no signature to confront, only process to navigate. Institutions defended the agreement as neutral, technical, and apolitical. That defense was its greatest shield. By denying intent, it avoided accountability. By framing itself as necessity, it discouraged imagination. Alternatives were dismissed not as wrong, but as unrealistic. The agreement had defined the boundaries of thought. Over time, compliance became indistinguishable from competence. Officials who worked comfortably within the framework advanced. Those who questioned it were labeled impractical. Careers adapted, incentives aligned. What could not be remembered could no longer be resisted. By now, the truth was uncomfortable but clear. The agreement had not been forgotten by accident. It had been designed to be forgettable. And in that forgetfulness, it had become one of the most powerful forces shaping Europe's financial order. The tension reached its peak when the agreement began producing outcomes no one publicly defended, yet no one could reverse. Growth stalled where flexibility was needed. Risk concentrated where dispersion had once existed. Local solutions were rejected not because they failed, but because they did not fit the framework. The agreement had stopped coordinating behavior. It was dictating it. The conflict sharpened as elected leaders discovered the limits of their own authority. Campaign promises collided with invisible constraints. Policies approved domestically were quietly adjusted to remain compliant. When questioned, officials spoke of obligations, expectations, and credibility, words that pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. Power had not disappeared. It had been relocated into process. The buildup intensified when internal reviews surfaced across multiple institutions. Analysts warned that assumptions baked into the agreement no longer matched reality. Markets had evolved. Technology had shifted risk. Social tolerance for rigidity had thinned. Yet updating the framework proved nearly impossible. Every change required unanimous alignment among actors whose incentives no longer matched. Stasis became safer than reform. Public frustration spilled into open skepticism. Citizens sensed decisions were being made somewhere they could not see. Protest movements named different enemies, but shared the same intuition. Choice had narrowed without consent. Democracy felt procedural, while constraint felt automatic. Inside the system, some officials attempted quiet adaptation. Exceptions were carved out. Interpretations stretched. Informal workarounds multiplied. But these efforts only confirmed the problem. The agreement could bend, but only in silence, only for those fluent in its language. Transparency eroded further. By now, the forgotten agreement had revealed its final form. It was not a contract between parties. It was an operating environment, one that defined what could happen long before anyone asked what should happen. And until that environment itself became visible, Europe would remain governed by rules it never remembered choosing. The reckoning arrived when invisibility itself became the risk. A system that could not be named could not be trusted. And a framework no one remembered choosing could no longer claim legitimacy. Simply by enduring, the climax unfolded not through revolt, but exposure. Investigative reports traced the agreement's lineage for the first time in public view. Timelines were reconstructed. Decisions once labeled technical were revealed as political trade-offs made under pressure and never revisited. What shocked people was not the intent, but the permanence. Temporary alignment had hardened into permanent constraint without renewal. Once named, the agreement changed, not because it was repealed, but because it could finally be discussed. Legislatures demanded explanations. Institutions published assumptions long buried in annexes. The framework did not collapse under scrutiny, but it lost its immunity. For the first time, alternatives could be debated without being dismissed as impossible. The resolution unfolded slowly. Reviews replaced reverence. Flexibility was written into places once locked by habit. Not every constraint was removed, and not every rule softened. But the agreement stopped pretending to be neutral. It became what it always was, a choice shaped by context, and therefore subject to revision. What remained was a lesson. Systems gain power when they are forgotten. They lose it when they are understood. Memory restores agency not by destroying structure, but by reclaiming responsibility for it. Europe did not undo the agreement no one remembered signing. It remembered it. And in that act alone, the balance between process and power shifted. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? The